Я хотел бы читать лекцию по-русски, but the начальники told me English. So it will be in English. I will try to speak clearly. And if there are questions, you can transmit the questions. At the end, I will try to answer. And you can also write me an email, ili по-русски, or in English, and I will try to answer. I was asked to speak about epidemics and Jews. And I was concerned, first off, to say some things that are not written in an encyclopedia. I mean, if you are sitting to listen, you deserve to get something a little bit different. And secondly, I wanted to give some scope to the discussion. So I will try. I am the speaker and you are the judges. You will decide. The epidemics are a phenomenon which interests us very much today. As we shall see, they were less interested in a few thousand years ago, and even less interesting in prehistoric times, maybe 100,000 years ago. Now, if we look at ancient human beings in prehistoric times, what do we see? First off, we see some characteristics of reproduction. I will get to Jews later. But if we look at the human beings are built to have between 10 and 12 children, possibly per woman. Not significantly more, although there are always exceptions. If we look at other creatures, we see very differing numbers of offspring. Mice have huge numbers of offspring all the time. And this, of course, is because the mortality of mice is much higher than the mortality of humans. Elephants have 4 or 5 offspring in a lifetime. Pregnancy for an elephant is 2 years. Why? Because here the mortality is relatively low, and the goal of evolution is to have a balance so that their next generation will be more or less the same size as the previous generation. So we see from this that if human beings have 10, 12 offspring, and what is necessary is for 2 to 3 to survive, that evolution takes into account a mortality rate of something around 70%, which for us today is extremely high, but that's the way it was in the past. The early humans were not farmers. The first human beings were hunters and gatherers. They were nomads. They moved in very small groups, populations of 5, 15, 20, but not significantly larger than that. The development of settlements, of towns or villages before towns, was linked to the transition from hunting to agriculture. And this changed the dynamics of the human condition. Humans who were agriculturalists lived in one place. They began to live in houses next to each other. And in this condition of concentration and permanent dwellings and the development of animals that lived with humans, such as dogs and cats and sheep and cattle and mice and rats and fleas and all the other less popular aspects of the natural world, that began to be also part of the human landscape. Now, these earliest settlements were relatively isolated. And the result was that the contact between community to community was limited. And since the contacts between communities were limited, the potential for the spread of disease was also relatively limited. However, with the development of both regional political groupings, the development of trade and exchange of objects, then conditions developed which made it possible for diseases that were focused on human beings to develop, whether microbes, bacteria, or viruses, and the potential for the spread of disease also developed. So thus, we can look at epidemics as a reflection of the development of what we can call civilization, the development of urbanization, of agriculture, of trade, of communications. The price that we paid for that, or one of the prices that we paid, was epidemics. When we try to control epidemics, in a certain sense, we try to recreate primitive conditions. We want clean water, we want clean air, we want to avoid the contact of cities, so we have less contact with our neighbors. Basically, what we are trying to do is to go back in time to a reality which epidemics did not have their conditions for spread. So, with this explanation that epidemics are not part of the nature of human existence, but they're part of the nature of human civilization, we can begin to look a little bit at the responses and of Jews to epidemics, and also the impact of epidemics on Jews. So, with this introduction, we can now look at the Bible, which saw human history as a little different. The biblical picture sees agriculture as present from the very beginning. The stories of the first book of the Torah assume that man was created to be a farmer. But this is the biblical picture of reality, and it reflected a reality in which people assumed that there was a society of farmers, of peasants, of agriculturists. In the biblical world, there were nomads, but they went with their sheep or with their goats. There was no society of wanderers who lived by hunting. That was already in pre-biblical times. Now, the world of the Bible takes death as something natural that does not need much explanation. We have the story in Genesis of Eve and Adam eating from the tree of knowledge and almost eating from the tree of life. This offers an explanation for the universal phenomenon of death. So that does not need explanation. And good health is also does not need explanation. That is taken for granted. What needs explanation is what was exceptional, not normal and not standard. Now, this we can see in a very interesting part of the Bible, not when we're looking for it for biblical history, but when we're looking at the Bible to understand the biblical view. So that the 10 plagues are for us a somewhat of a catalog of what interested the biblical figures. The 10 plagues in English, in Hebrew, Eser Makot, a makah is a blow. In Russian, which is very good translation, Deset Nakazani, Nakazania is a response to doing something wrong. It is not random, it is a response to doing evil, which is very, very good translation. So if we take a look, the first are odd phenomena. The river turning into blood, the frogs coming into the houses, and then we have the diseases of animals. We have humans suffering from various diseases, which we could call a medical plague. Then we have, and this is part of the careful construction of the biblical story, the fifth nakazania, the fifth plague, is dever, the death of animals by disease. And the 10th is the death of the firstborn. On the one hand, this is a physical, medical plague, a disease, the death of many people, but it happens in a non-typical way because it is just the firstborn. So that we see that phenomena which are not regarded as normal, not the individual death, but many deaths, they are called for explanation. Why do they exist? Now, in the biblical world, this is usually regarded as a punishment, nakazania here is good, for sin. A population which does things which are wrong will be punished, so that the people of the town of Sodom were punished for their sins. The city was destroyed. The Egyptian regime was persecuting in populations, the Jews who had not done wrong, they were punished. So that in the world of the Bible, epidemics are not part of the natural order. They are something which needs explanation. In a sense, we sometimes do that ourselves without noticing what we're doing. We discuss health problems as being the result of overpopulation, of a lack of cleanliness, even though sometimes cleanliness is bad for the health and a little bit of dirt is good. But we don't like to say that. We like to say that Disease comes from not being clean, not being close to nature. And this is, in a sense, our modern way of explaining what a sin, what a grech is. So that if we take a look at the book of Leviticus in chapter 26, for those of you who really want to open a Bible, it's Leviticus chapter 26, verse 25. There, the Jews are told that if the Jews sin, that there will be punished by epidemics, and they will spread and people will die in their masses. What is interesting is the next verse. The next verse says, and when I cut off your supply of bread, 10 women will bake in one oven. There will be so little wheat. What reality is being hinted at here or described here? After the pestilence, we refer to cooking bread, which is a problem of agriculture. This is a situation in which, again, human society has developed, and it is now people are living in concentrations. And this appears over and over. In the book of Numbers, we have descriptions of diseases. And then when a priest goes and takes his incense or makes a fire with leaves that cause a good smell, this, by doing a holy act, or what they saw as a holy act, will control the disease. The views of the Bible that epidemics do not happen by accident, but they are a reflection of God being angry, is repeated later on in the Talmud. Why am I interested in this? Because in a later period, we were going to see people who stopped seeing epidemics as a sign that God is angry, and they will bring more natural explanations. But we have to get there. This view was not in the time of the Bible. It came much, much later. There's actually a very interesting problem in the study of modern communications, which research was done on how to spread new ideas, how to spread modern technology. And work was done on this in the 20th century, not so long ago. And one of the problems to teach modern technology was to teach people to boil water, not to drink water that comes from a well, without boiling it to clean bacteria. And we all know that water can be infected by bacteria, it can transmit disease. So there were very, very good-hearted doctors and nurses who would go to villages in different places and try to teach people to boil water. And one of the interesting case studies dealt with by sociologists was in Mexico, where a group of doctors and nurses, everybody with a medical degree and a curriculum vitae and graduate of university, and they went to the village and they told the people, you know that you get sick and you use voodoo and you use magic. This doesn't work. Why? Because the water you have has tiny animals in it, and they make you sick. And they have to be killed by boiling the water. And the people of the village listened very politely because all of these people were doctors and nurses from universities. They spoke and they listened. And at the end of the talk, after everybody had explained why it is so important to boil water, the people said, I have never seen a little animal in the water. My father has never seen a little animal and my mother in the water. My mother didn't tell me. What are you talking about? You are believers in magic. We are believers in a more rational medicine. We take leaves and flowers, and sometimes that helps. But to boil water to kill animals that you can't see, that is nonsense. And all the doctors and nurses had to think of a better way to teach their modern medicine. So that in the ancient world, there was no reason to think that bacteria and viruses who could not be seen were the cause. So we find then in rabbinic literature also the same type of ideas that regard the disease and epidemics as the product of sin. So it says in the Mishnah, in the book or tractate of Ta'anit, it's a tractate that deals with fast days, that if there is an epidemic, what do? You take a shofar and blow the shofar, the horn, and then everybody knows that there is something bad, and you announce a fast day. And you do this not only when there is a disease, but if a strong building falls down, you also fast. And if you have a lack of food, you also fast. And if there is a lack of rain, you also fast. And here we have clear understanding that various undesirable activities are events come to inform us or inform a population that they have sinned. Now, what does the Mishnah do that goes on? Here is an element which could almost be adopted in a modern study of health. The Mishnah asks, this is in about the year 200, what is a plague? What is an epidemic? And the Mishnah gives an answer. It says that if you have a city which has a population big enough to supply 500 soldiers, so we're dealing with a city of at least, say, 5,000 people. Now, if 3 people die each day for 3 days, that is a plague. So that we have a statistic. It's actually a relatively low statistic. We're talking about 10 in a town of at least 5,000. So we're talking about 1 in 500. This is even less than the death rate today for corona. But something like this, repeated deaths day after day, which are higher than usual, that is a definition of plague. And for that, one has to fast. The Talmud it was written after the Mishnah, and we find in the Talmud ideas that reflect not only concepts of medicine in Palestine or in Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah reflects medical knowledge in the land of Israel. The Talmud reflects Babylonian medicine, which was not identical. And the Talmud discusses plagues, and in the book of Bava Kama, it says, if there is a plague, stay inside the house and wait for the plague to go by. This is what great rabbis would do in a plague. They would close their windows and stay inside. Now, the same Talmud goes on to say, if there is a famine, what should you do? If there is not enough food, what should you do? Leave the town and go to a place where there is food. Now, this is interesting in a number of ways. First off, what types of populations can migrate in the case of a famine? Urban populations. Populations that live in towns and cities who have skills that they can take with them, whether it be a shoemaker or a tailor or a person who buys and sells, they can leave. And this historically characterized Jewish populations until the modern period. And this is why Jewish populations tend to be more mobile. They tend to move quicker than other populations, because a population which is a land-owning population that works as a farmer or as a peasant, it's not so easy to move, because without land, a peasant is lost. So that when there is a famine, the advice was move, go to a place where there's food, but when there is a epidemic, close the doors. This goes against much of our experience, in which we see that very often people, when there is an epidemic, flee. They want to get away from the city where there is a danger of being infected. However, what is the consequence of a person leaving a city and going to a safer place? These same people can transmit or carry disease with them. And the Talmud here, consciously or unconsciously, reflects a concern not only for an individual who wants to save himself, but also for society. In the case of a plague society, quarantine, staying in the same place, is the best step for society, and multiple population movements is not desirable. Now, this was the view of the Talmud. In the medieval period, then the approach of rabbinical scholars was different. And since my time is limited, I will only deal with some. One great Italian rabbi, Moses of Trani, said, first off, what should you do if there is a case of plague? And he is writing in the 16th century. What should you do? You should flee. Go from the city to the countryside. Where did the Rabbi Moshe get this idea? Maybe he read Boccaccio, with the stories of the refugees who are sitting together exchanging stories. Perhaps he got it from somewhere else. But certainly this was a common European response to plague. Those who had money left the city, and those who didn't stayed. If you say, Shaul Shtampfer talks and talks, but does he really have evidence? Take a look at New York today. The rich people of New York left. They went to the north of America, to the countryside. They went south to Pennsylvania. Who stayed in New York? The people who did not have enough money to rent a dacha in a safe place. This is a response which is good for the individual who leaves. For society, it's more problematic. Rav Moshe said, like everybody in Europe, that look out for yourself. However, Rav Moshe also had to deal with theology. He saw a plague as punishment. And if you escape the plague, what are you doing? You are also escaping punishment. A person deserves a nakazania, a punishment for something he did, and he is avoiding it. How can that be? After all, according to Jewish tradition, on Yom Kippur, the fate of every individual is decided. So the Rav Moshe had an answer. He said, listen, that running away from your house, going to a strange place, trying to find a way to settle down, that's almost as bad as dying. That is definitely a punishment. So if God wanted to punish an individual, this person got his punishment. True, he stayed alive, but it was almost as bad as dying. Now, we all know from football that there is a big difference between a goal and almost a goal. Similarly, there's a difference between dying and almost dying. But for Rav Moshe, this solved the theological problem because ultimately he could not free himself from the idea that an epidemic does not happen by accident. It has to have a reason and a function. Now, this view became part of Jewish law, and in the Shulchan Aruch, the standard book of Jewish law, he said that it is a question of Jewish law that when a disease spreads and when many people are not only sick, but many people are dying, then it is necessary to fast and to pray. What is the cure for a disease? Convincing God that enough suffering has taken place and to ask God to change the fate of the community. So we see that until the late Middle Ages or early modern period, the link between sin and punishment that lies behind epidemics was at the basis of Jewish thought. Now, if we look at Jewish responses to epidemics in the medieval period, the first place that one would expect to look at would be to look at the situation that existed after the Black Death. In the middle of the 14th century and starting around 1348, the Black Death spread through Europe and led to havoc that is difficult to understand today. It's not clear whether 30% of the entire population of Europe died, or 35%, or maybe 40%, but there was a massive death rate. And for the Jews, the response, the Black Death brought in many areas of the German-speaking lands in what's Germany and Austria to a death rate of very close to 100%. It was high, not quite, but almost. Now, you might say correctly, 100%. There is no epidemic that we know of that led to a death rate that high. And the answer is that the Jews did not die only because of the epidemic. When the epidemic came, the death rate of the Jews was quite similar to that of their neighbors. The death rate was spread by little bugs that lived on rats, mishi that spread, and the rats did not discriminate. It was an egalitarian society. They went to the houses of Jews, they went to the houses of non-Jews, they brought the bugs with them. Everybody could get sick. However, when the Black Death came, it caused a great deal of terror in society because, for very understandably, nobody had ever seen anything like it. Now, how is it that the Black Death came and spread and killed so many people in Europe? And we can also ask, why is it that the Black Death did not do the same in all of the later centuries? The disease remained, but we did not have epidemics with 30%, 40% of the population dying. And the answer is that this is a disease that had not been known in Europe. It had been known in what is now the Middle East, in India, in Asia, and with growing trade and the spread of commerce, the rats, and with them the disease, came from probably Istanbul to India, and from India it spread along the trade routes, and along with silk, and along with pepper, and along with luxury goods came the rats and the disease. And they found a population which had no historical or natural immunity. And this led to a huge mortality rate, and it called for explanation. People asked, why is it that so many people are dying so quickly? The explanation, one of the explanations that was given was that this cannot happen naturally. It must be a poison. Somebody or some bodies is spreading the disease deliberately. And We see this, of course, today, very interestingly, with the coronavirus. There is a whole world of people who say that this is a secret plot to spread a disease, and it was made in a laboratory and then distributed in the world. This is not true. It was not made in a laboratory. Anybody who knows very much about viruses can see by the genetic characteristics of corona that it did not come from a laboratory. But as we all know, when somebody believes something, they are not interested in the facts. But what is common to everybody is a desire to understand how could it be that such a terrible disease, in this case, the Black Plague, was truly terrible, could kill so many people, and for many people, the only explanation was that it was people who deliberately poisoned the population. Now, the Black Plague spread in places where there were no Jews. There were no Jews in England at that time. There were very few Jews in France. It did not make any difference. The evidence was irrelevant. The only question was, who were the people who were spreading the poison? Now, the first population that was seen as guilty was beggars. Beggars were killed in many places because they were seen as spreaders of the disease. Now, you can ask logically, does this make sense? It's not so simple. To buy poison costs money. It's not so easy to purchase poison. So if you don't want to purchase it, you need a laboratory to make it. Beggars do not have the facilities, the institutions, the money. Why beggars? Well, what do beggars do? They ask for money. And why do they ask for money? Because they need money. They don't have a house. They don't have good living conditions. And when people look at beggars and beggars ask for money, what is usually the case? If people give money, they give a little bit of money. They give, at best, something. However, a beggar usually does not get enough money to improve his life. And if we look at people who we know need our help, we know that we live much better than they do. Underneath it all, we can offer explanations why we do not give enough money to poor people, but basically we feel guilty. Somehow it's not right that some people in our society live relatively well and others live not so well. It does not feel comfortable. How can we make ourselves feel better? We can say that beggars are really there because they should be punished. Maybe they take drugs. That's why they're begging. They're druggers. They are people who take narcotici. They deserve living as they do because they should not. Or they're people who did not study. This is a punishment. If we can say that they are bad, then we can clean our conscience. we are not we do not have to say that we should give more. We should not give more. They are doing something that is wrong. Just 1 minute. Now, so what can we do then with what was done with the beggars? In the Middle Ages, in order to clean the conscience, to say the beggars should get charity, but they are not, say that they are evil. And if they're evil, we can understand why they try to poison and spread disease. So beggars were killed. This was very common in Italy and Germany. In Germany, the address switched. In Germany, who was the population that was killed? It was the Jews. And in Germany, almost all of the Jewish population was killed in several years from 1348 to 1352. What is interesting is that the organization of the killings of the Jews, if you want to use a term which is not correct historically, pogrom, but it was the same phenomena, was organized not by the masses, but by the leadership, by the educated, by the rulers, all of whom were gripped by hysteria, and they could not understand what could be happening, why so many people are dying, unless we say that it's the Jews who are doing this, and we have to kill them to save our lives. Why the Jews? On the one hand, there was a deep-seated hatred of Jews. If the Jews could kill Jesus, who was the Son of God, they certainly can kill us. And also an awareness that the Jews had been mistreated by their fellow citizens, in which case people could say to themselves, if I was a Jew, I really would not like my neighbors. I would do things to punish them. I could understand why Jews would try to poison us, so people could say. And therefore, this is a rational explanation, even though it is totally illogical. And the price that Jews paid was very, very high. From that time on, there were no mass Jewish populations in Germany. There were a few cities for one reason or another had large populations, but already in the year 1500, the number of Jews in Eastern Europe was equal to that in Western Europe. Why? Not so because there were so many Jews in Eastern Europe, but because most of the Jews in Western Europe had been killed. Now, what is worthy of note, and this we will come to, is that epidemics in the later periods, if we take cholera, smallpox, or the same plague which returned again, the same Black Death, which was not as severe, there were no more acts of violence against Jews. There were riots when cholera spread in various places in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in North America. There were riots, but the riots were not directed against the Jews or against other minorities. The riots were directed against governments. The riots were directed against doctors. Doctors were taking sick people with cholera to hospitals. And what happened to them in hospitals? Most of them died. Why is a person taken to a hospital? Because that person is sick. Doctors did what they could to save people, but they died. For many people on the street, they said, what did the doctors do? They killed the person. Why are so many people dying? Doctors are killing people. They're opening their bodies to do experiments. They're taking parts out of their bodies. They're doing all kinds of wicked things because they hate the poor people. And as a result, there were riots against doctors. There were riots against governments. Governments tried to make quarantines. People said, quarantines don't work. Bring proof. And it's not easy to prove. And as a result, there were riots against government officials, but not against Jews. This was a one-time phenomena during the Black Death in the 14th century. Now, if we take a look at the 19th century, then we see very, very different developments, and developments which are very, very curious. We have in 1848, there was an epidemic of cholera in Vilnius, and there Jews cooperated with the non-Jews in terms of treating the disease, in terms of trying to eliminate social contact which spread disease, making sure that their houses would be clean so that animals would not spread disease. In other words, the Jews began to internalize and accept the explanation that epidemics are not a direct intervention by God, but they are a natural process which has to be treated not only by prayer or not by prayer, but also by treating the natural causes of the disease. And this is even before Pasteur made it possible to understand how it was that a disease spread. The cure, quarantine, and cleanliness was in place before the explanation existed. Now, the last example I want to bring is from a period which is relatively close to our period, and that is the first years of the Holocaust of the Shoah. As we all know, one of the steps taken by the Nazis was to concentrate the Jews in ghettos. The largest ghetto was the ghetto of Warsaw, with hundreds of thousands of Jews in an extremely small area. And in 1941, before the ghetto was emptied by the Nazis, there was an outbreak of typhus within the ghetto, an epidemic which led to thousands of deaths month by month. The Jewish community was totally isolated. It was living on a food allotment of about 300 calories per day. 300 calories per day is so far below the minimum necessary for normal existence, it doesn't even come near. The population was starving, disorganized, or relatively disorganized, and under the constant terror of the Nazi regime. However, a medical committee in the ghetto took control and began, first off, educating people what is necessary to control typhus, especially cleanliness and avoiding conditions where mice and rats could spread, the importance of personal cleanliness, the importance of not coming together in large groups, but isolation, and the conditions on the ghetto began to be changed by the Jews themselves to the degree that it was possible. The typhus began to spread in the spring, and as winter came, the weather got colder. By all medical standards, typhus is a degree that spreads most in the winter. People crowd together, it's hard to clean, and the mice who spread the bugs that is exactly the conditions which are good for them. To everybody's amazement, the level of the epidemic in the ghetto began to decline in October, and as the winter went on, against all of the predictions, the level went lower and lower until the epidemic was gone. The only explanation is not medical treatment and not a change by the German policies to increase the food allotments, but the self-control, the self-education, the self-leadership of the Jewish community, even on the most extreme conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto, were able to control typhus. Natural epidemics could be controlled, the Nazis could not, and almost everyone involved in the medical committee found their death in Auschwitz. But until that day when they could do no more, they responded. And here we see the total acceptance of the Jews of a totally different understanding of epidemics and an acceptance of the modern medical ways to intervene, to control, and to make lives of everyone safer. There is much more that can be said, but I am not the one to say anymore. I have completed what I wanted to say. I will tell you from the start, there are many things I don't know. What I do know, I'll be happy to share with you in answers. And there are many good books and articles that you can read on the topic.
Thank you very much. Could you check, there's one question on the chat. Would you like me to read it, or you will read it yourself and answer? What's the best for you?
Well, okay, there are a number of questions in this one very interesting comment. I'm happy to see that it's only 20%. My feeling is that when people get a phone call for a survey, most people do not want to tell the truth, and that why say something that can get you in trouble? I suspect that more people would believe that. However, I think that in the Middle Ages, with the Black Death, many, many more people saw the Jews as guilty for the Black Death simply because the mortality was so much higher and people were they were more frightened. In the later periods of the Middle Ages, we do not see again attacks on Jews, which to me is evidence that fewer saw Jews as responsible for later epidemics. So it depends which epidemic of the Middle Ages one talks about. 20% is lower than the first major epidemic. It might be reasonable for what people thought later in the Middle Ages. Should we be happy if it's lower? Everybody decides what should make you happy. I would be happy if nobody thought that was true. But people like to blame. They like to say there is somebody guilty. And they don't want to say if we live in cities, if we have farms, if we see each other in a big building, that this is against nature. Nature built human beings to be primitive. And if we want to live in a modern world, there is a price. But people don't like to pay a price. They like to say somebody else is guilty.
Any more questions? Yeah, there's a few
Oh,
more. Yep.
biblical, well, is this proof of biblical perception? Well, it depends how you define biblical. If you say biblical perceptions are that God is intervening, I think that fewer people say that God is intervening. If you want to say it's a punishment for globalization, that's somewhat biblical because it likes to use the word guilty. There are few words that are more beautiful than vinovat. What is more beautiful is on vinovat. The word yavinovat the phrase is very rare. We don't say yavinovat, it's always on, or anas sometimes. But I think that people who see it as a punishment for globalization, they see guilt. On the other hand, people say that globalization is bad, but does that mean that you don't want to drink French wine? No. French wine is different. Or you don't want to have caviar in France? Well, everybody in France knows that caviar is fantastic. That's different. Or we don't want to buy a computer from China? No. So people are against globalization except when it costs them money. When they have to pay money, then all of a sudden they change the song. They say something different. So I think that it is better to be careful and not to go to places where there are crowds today and not to start making a war against globalization, because we really are not against. Now, we have another question.
Shaul, I answered this question on your behalf because it's just a bit misunderstanding due to the English. I answered actually based on your lecture.
Oh, okay.
You missed one question. Can you go above? There's a question from Irina. Is related to this kashrut rituals.
Yeah, I'm really a bad person, so I'm going to be bad. I don't think that kashrut made Jews more healthy than non-Jews. I just don't think so. I don't see that kosher meat is more healthy than non-kosher meat, and I eat only kosher food, but not because I think it makes me healthy, because I would say would not like to think that God told Jews to be kosher and to be healthy, and God doesn't care if non-Jews eat non-kosher food and get sick. I can't believe that that's what God would do, that he would play a trick and give Jews more healthy food than anybody else. Because if God made everybody, then he's responsible for everybody. So I really do not like that idea. I don't know if I'm sobludayushi, but I try. But I think that a good God cares for everybody. I think that keeping kashrut has many values in terms of self-control. There are many non-kosher foods that I want to eat. I really want to eat, but they're not kosher. And I have to control myself. I think control is good. I think there are other good reasons for kashrut. So I don't think that that is the reason. Although I told you I'm wicked, maybe the high level of corona among ultra-Orthodox is because they're eating kashrut, but it's not so kosher. Maybe they're cheating themselves. Maybe they're faking themselves. But I don't think that's the reason. I really don't think so. I think there are two major reasons. One is the ultra-Orthodox live in more crowded conditions. If you have 3 children in an apartment or 10 children in an apartment, there's a difference. And if you live in a building where everybody has 8 children, that's different than a building where people have fewer. So I think that's probably a better explanation for the higher level of corona. I also think that many ultra-Orthodox are suspicious of doctors. They find it difficult to understand how it is that a doctor who eats shvinya, who eats pig, who is not observant on Shabbat, it is difficult to understand why his advice on medicine has to be listened to, even though there are explanations. But I think that the many of them are suspicious of doctors, and it takes a while for them to overcome their suspicion. They do, but it takes time. Let's see.
There's,
Now,
yeah, I would suggest one more. Actually, it's a one last question, and then we finish because we are run out of time for 10 minutes already. There's a question about the disease in Torah called tsarat, if I'm
oh, that's a
pronouncing.
very easy question for me. I don't know what sarat is. Nobody knows what sarat is. We know that it's bad, and we know that we don't have it today. So that's something good. And that's all.
Okay, then thank you very much. There's also thanks in our chat for your very interesting lection. And thank you for your time spending with us today. I think that's all for today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very, very much, and be well.
Thank you.